That sounds about right, I guess. 4 or 5.
Yeah, 4 or 5 times. So good to have you back. But we've got a great show lined up about what millennials don't get, which is quite a lot more than what we can cover in one episode. But we're going to
No, we're gonna go for it.
we're going to go for it anyway and see what we can do. Thanks to William and thanks to Ted for sending donations during the week. William sent a very generous donation, $300 this week. Really appreciate the support from the public. Hit the super chats down there, mash the like and subscribe buttons and all of that good stuff, and get notifications for the show. Really can't do it without you. Greatly appreciate everyone's support. So, we're just gonna go off the deep end here on a lot of this stuff, and this is going to somewhat follow what you discussed in the last show that we did about 3 months ago regarding the behavioral sink and whatnot, I think, and people should probably go back and listen to some of that. It was Tiny Tim and the Future of Humanity, and you had figured out some things, so we're going to build off of that somewhat today, I think. But you go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No,
You first.
Well, I think I think we're ready to dive in and just kind of enjoy it.
We're ready to break our vow of silence from before the show.
Right. Well, you and I see, whenever we do a show together, it's better if the show is organic. If you and I rehearse it or go over the notes, it sounds rehearsed and whatnot.
Our discussions are more interesting before we start the show sometimes.
Right, exactly. That is a problem. So we decided to just sit here and
we've been looking at each other for 15 minutes.
We're not going to say anything, so we have an organic conversation. So there you go. So anyway.
I promised to tell an anecdote to start things off that happened to me in the last few weeks.
All right.
I'm kind of a Renaissance kind of guy, and when I don't understand things, I try to research them. And one of the things that I do is I've been trying to learn over the decades. I've tried to learn how to paint, and I've taken several courses on how to do sunsets. And what I found is, if you start going into it, you start realizing, and you can look this up on, there's plenty of YouTube videos on it, that most art courses teach you the wrong color wheel. You take a physics course, you take an art course, they'll tell you that the primary colors are yellow, red, and blue. And somehow within that, you're supposed to get every other color that you can possibly imagine. If you want to paint a sunset, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to mimic the spectrum as determined by Isaac Newton. And everything goes from red, the Roy G. Biv thing, until you pick up your paints and you realize none of that works. If you really look at the color wheel, the very definition of primary colors is that like the blue, a very deep blue, isn't supposed to be mixable by any more subtle colors. But if you look at your printer, the primary colors on every printer in the entire United States, if not the world, doesn't use the primary colors as you're taught in physics class. Okay, and you ask yourself why. The primary colors in your printer is yellow, cyan, and magenta.
Right.
And these colors mimic what's on a TV. It's an entire color theory that they actually use that actually does work. So what you do is I started researching where did we get derailed on this, and why do all the why has academia been teaching you the wrong color wheel for the last 100, 200 years? And it turns out Isaac Newton is the first person to take a prism and actually supposedly deconstruct the spectrum. Not long after, a philosopher scientist named Johannes Goethe said it was a fraud. He said that you take a spectrum, and he's assuming that you have such a thing as white light, and it gets broken up by the spectrum, and that's what makes your prism. Except when Goethe went out and bought a prism, none of it worked. And I dare say that when I took science class, the same thing happened to me. And then they'd say, well, it was really the prism that broke up the light. And then you try to replicate it. And they say, well, don't take a prism, take a diffraction grating or something like that. And what you find out when Newton went to the Royal Society and said, here's what I did, the Royal Society basically threw him out and said, this doesn't work. Goethe went and looked at it and he said, you know, I'm considering here that it's really not the prism that breaks up the light. It's the little pinhole that Newton made in his shade that let the light in, that it was the refraction off the edges that actually generated the color. So Goethe did this very long, he spent 40 years researching this. And the only thing I can think of, and you do a little bit of research on it, is most of academia followed the mathematical line of pursuit. But they totally dismissed the phenomenology of the thing that Goethe had showed, and nobody's actually figured it out yet. And the reason I bring this up is a little bit of an anecdote, not that I want to get into colors, but there's tons of things academia every day teaches that isn't scientifically, isn't historically right. And you can look it up from the flat earth, the whole idea that the world believed the earth was flat until Christopher Columbus was made up in the 19th century.
Yeah. Wasn't it Irving something or other who made that up?
Washington Irving.
Washington Irving, thank you.
Yeah, he made it up in a poem, but it was built on by two guys named Draper and White. One was from Cornell University. And it was purposely, and you can download the book, they purposely created a war between religion and science that never had existed. And I can go into that too, but the thing is that what puzzles me is how much of you can go out any day of the week and look at the sunset. Science doesn't explain what's there. They give you a whole line of really what amounts to is crap. And you can just look up go on YouTube, look up Goethe's theory of light, and you'll see a whole nother explanation. Not that Newton's entirely wrong, but he's not explaining the phenomena that's there.
Well, a couple of things. Sir Isaac Newton, and I just showed him up on the brain database here, but he was an alchemist, and, he stole a good part of calculus from Calcutta and whatnot. But when I've done my investigations into the Royal Society, I have come across, fraud after fraud with that group. I mean, Karl Marx, of all people, was a member of the Royal Society. Julian and Thomas Huxley were members of the Royal Society, and it goes downhill from there. But, so you've got these eugenicists and these people that are known to spin information for their own agendas, but the Royal Society is thick with that stuff for the last nearly 400 years, 300 and some odd years that they've been around.
Right, and I would go into deeper than that even, is that what you're going to find, and to get more to the point where this is Logos media and used to be Gnostic media, it really, this goes back to what Gnosticism really is. And what you really find is academia is pretty much in general following the Gnostic path, and they're ignoring the Logos path, which is what we've really been talking about. The reason Newton followed the path he was is because the actual biggest event in religion and science was a thing called the Council of Florence in 1431, where the Catholic Church decided that it was going to heal all the splits between the East and West and everything. The Muslims were bearing down on them. But so they had this big, huge council, kind of like a Vatican II type thing we would have maybe remember today. But what happened is all these books started flooding into the Western world and most of them were Gnostic texts. And they didn't know what to do with them. The primary Gnostic text was a thing called the Corpus Hermeticum. This came in from that was, if you do the research, you'll find out was really the Corpus Hermeticum that inaugurated the scientific revolution. It was the Corpus Hermeticum, when it appeared, that was considered to be the lost third testament of the Bible. And it never was really refuted till hundreds of years later. But it's the indoctrination and the re-indoctrination. If you want to do a history of the church that the church won't teach you, in a normal seminary, follow the history of the Corpus Hermeticum back to early Gnosticism, and you will find you'll start uncovering the frauds of science. You'll start uncovering the frauds of religion going all the way back.
When they don't want to adhere to logos, and you and I had done a couple of shows, and Todd and I and Lloyd and I recommend people go all the way back and watch our whole series that we did on Islam, because we follow that through all the way through the Sufis into the Gnostics and show how they've been manipulating the information and everything throughout history. And and then once you grasp, when you get your mind really around logos, you begin to see this fraud being perpetuated on society. But try to explain it to someone else, it's like,
what you end up with is you have a side that goes back to early Pythagoreanism, which tries to find a mystical, magical, mathematical solution to everything. When they taught logos, it was really not that mathematics didn't work or they ignored it, but that meaning was the primary. Meaning and reason and logic superseded any kind of mathematical discussion. Mathematics was the servant to logos, not the other way around.
Right. Well, and then you get into this issue with mathematics, and especially with this quantum physics hyperbole, that the map becomes the territory.
Mm-hmm.
Where people, you can't know truth. There's 12 different realities and whatnot because the math says so. And rather than, but you have people building these theories that don't have a foundation first in critical thinking.
The hard part that I've had in the last month, because I really think the Dead Sea Scrolls was the turning point of all this. Certainly Gnosticism existed before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but something needed to sell the world that the default state of society, the default state of Christianity, and the default state of religion was what I would call Hermeticism, but really Hermeticism and Marxism and all that, they're really in the same field. Marx, socialism, they all are joined at the hip. The biggest problem, as we discussed before the show briefly, the biggest problem I have with academia and most of the scholars I work with is it's taken for granted today that early Christianity was a Gnostic religion. That it was, and by Gnostic, it's not just that they were into Gnosticism, but that Christ was a socialist, Christ was a progressive.
Let me interrupt you before you go into that, because we have someone in the chat who is repeating this line of thinking right now. Kujam Rosalgetti, he says, the Logos is Gnostic.
That's what's taught today.
Right.
Yes.
You think they killed the man for being conventional, for corrupting the youth? Logos, baby. Logos is known by Gnosticism, or going within to hear the voice of truth in love, for service by the crucible that brings the hope of wisdom.
Kind of a word salad to me.
Right. Well, yeah, there's always that problem too, and I agree with you on that. But it could be a second or third language as well.
The problem is, again, the main reason I contacted you early on was the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if we just look at that as kind of the window onto that period, what you see, and it's true, you do see a sect, for instance, that breaks off from the main group of Jews, goes out in the middle of nowhere, decides that they're going to share all their goods share their goods in common, and that's going to be a model for society somehow. And then they project that onto Christ, that somehow Christ had this group of people, that he was this wisdom person in their sense. But if you really do the study on the Dead Sea Scrolls, none of this that was pushed in the 40s and 50s has ever actually even thrown up to be true. Number one, if you're going to go into a desert and you're just going to take a few people with you, of course you're going to share your goods and stuff like that, but it's not like you're going to... Most of the people that went to Qumran, in fact, all the people that went to Qumran were They're highly conservative. They had very odd bathroom habits. They thought that the temple had become perverted, and so nowhere were they taking this ideal society they were creating and projecting it as a utopia for the rest of the world to live. The utopian society that they had built was only survivable by a very few. It had nothing to do with the state taking over and running the world in this, in what you would normally think of this beneficial way to everybody, where everybody shares their goods. Marxism would, and that's really the cause. That you go back there and you say, well, that's the ideal society. Anybody who does the research would quickly find out that was no ideal society.
Right. And then that is spread out into 20,000 some failed hippie communes in the 60s and 70s, and that all were based on this same false communist ideology.
Yeah, you'd have to go back to the beginning. Most people don't know this, but the word logos comes from the beginning of John's gospel. A lot of people don't know this, but John's gospel is really a paraphrase of the opening of Genesis. And up until that point, most religions were idealistic in that you didn't think in terms of reality being real. The typical person, if you want to call him a scientist in the period, thought that reality was projected from your eyes out. That world was really some sort of platonic spheres and shapes and stuff like that. But because they mistranslate John's gospel and the whole concept of logos, the logos literally means the world was made real. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was made tangible, which was an affirmation that reality actually is tangible and it's just it's not a mental construct.
Well, and that's, when you get into trivium studies, that's really the first axiom.
Right.
Is that reality is real. There are no contradictions in nature. A contradiction is always a lie or an error, because God cannot lie. Jesus is the way, the truth, the life, and Satan is the father of all lies. So once you accept that reality is real.
And what you said just now, those 2 points, reality is concrete, and there's no such thing as a real. Something can't something can't contradict itself. The principle of non-contradiction has to always be, it reigns. The issue that happens is, most people don't know this too, but the main text in the Corpus Hermeticum was a perversion of John's gospel. And so Gnosticism literally began with them paraphrasing John, the opening sentence of beginning was the word, and replacing it with a mystical kind of Pythagorean mathematical sort of version of logos. And then what happened is that you had researchers that were inspired by Hegel, like F.C. Bauer and things, that went back and basically tried to say that the Gospel of John was transported to about 180 AD and was completely out of place. And they had, in fact, in a lot of Bibles you get to this day, they'll tell you that John's Gospel was written 180 AD, and that proves it was a Gnostic gospel. That proves that Christianity was a Gnostic religion, except for the fact that they've now found fragments that put John's gospel exactly where it says it's supposed to be, around 100 AD.
This guy's throwing a fit now in the chat. He thinks, well, you can't define logos. You can't define experience. Of course you can define logos. It might take you 20,000 words to define it, but of course you can define it.
Well, you'd have to go to Heraclitus. Heraclitus specifically says, Heraclitus is constantly being taken wrong. He's being quoted as a person saying that there's the only thing certain is change, but what he really meant by that is that which was changeless would have to be God or some sort of permeating essence that controlled the world. So underneath a world of change demanded some sort of permanence. And that permanence he called logos. And that's really where the term developed from.
Somebody's having a bit of cognitive dissonance. I just had to put him on a 5-minute timeout, so...
Okay.
It's, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The more incompetent someone is, the more they think they know on a subject. Never mind that you've spent, decades looking into this stuff, but...
Well, the real, as we were discussing a little bit before the show, the problem again goes to the Council of Florence, and that a lot of these Plato had been made a heretic and was made by literally St. John Damascene around the year 500, 600. And the Platonic academies had been shut down until 1431. So Christianity exists from roughly around 600 to 1431. They didn't know about Plato at all. All the texts had been burned. And so these are some of the texts they had to get from the Muslims. And when they showed up, there was a writing in Augustine's text that said Christianity is closest to Platonism. So when the Corpus Hermeticum showed up, they thought this gave them license to authenticate all the Platonic texts and incorporate them into Christianity. What they missed, and all these scholars miss to this day, is Augustine also denounced Hermeticism. He has a whole chapter in the City of God, and it says specifically that Hermeticism is the devil's confederate. Hermeticism is literally the same as Gnosticism. And so where scholars get it wrong is we really don't know who Plato was. And so what happens is an old Plato, which is somewhat of an enigma. We best know him through Aristotle. And so scholars nowadays, when they go back to the early church, they don't call it Platonism, they call it Middle Platonism, which is really closer to what we talk about with logos. What then started arising was Gnosticism, what they usually call it is Neoplatonism. Then there's a whole period of Neoplatonism between around 150 AD till 1430, when the Council of Florence was. That's when Gnosticism went underground and became this mystical cult. And then when these documents started showing up from the East during the Council of Florence, that's when all this got reindoctrinated into Christianity. That's where modern science got its connections with, we tend to think that everybody before the Renaissance was stupid, but you go into the Bacons and the different people of the 12th century, they're brilliant. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, most people think that even people 200 or 300 years ago were idiots, and
right.
I've sat and read hundreds of the letters from the people at Salem, Mass in the 1690s, even earlier than that, the original settlers. And most people, they were so brilliant, most people wouldn't be able to understand them today. And most people believe, they were just stupid, superstitious Christians. And that's about the extent of their...
And that's true for the seminaries. That's true for all academia. I mean, it's not like these books aren't out there. You can get, for instance, the complete exposition of the Orthodox faith by John Damascene. It's clearly Aristotelian. It's very brilliant. You can get more or less the Book of Sentences, which was considered the basis of academia for 400, 500 years. You can get the writings of Aquinas. You can get the writings, several early church fathers that you can go in. All you'd have to do is take a collection of these bona fide people, brilliant people, and you'd realize that what they're peddling today has nothing to do with what they're talking about then.
Absolutely.
It's a fraud. It's a scam.
Yep. That's, and going back to Salem, that's what I found in my own study. I've got about 6 shelf feet of books on Salem.
Right.
And I went through it, and I found every book to either have an agenda or the author was flat out incompetent, you know?
Right. And I did the same thing with Gnosticism. You went all the way back. Gnosticism is a sort of oddball thing. Most people don't get. And the pure Gnostics were a group called the Manichaeans. And everybody has a tendency to look at these people philosophically. And what they really were about is a kind of a perversion of what order was. As an example, they would take one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. So what they set them up, they said that they consider this an absolute in a way that you can't kill anything. So you would end up with what they called perfects or prefects in time. And they couldn't eat, they couldn't walk, they couldn't, how do you live? They couldn't have sex, they couldn't do anything. But what happened is that now how do you
try not to tap on that on the desk there. It's coming into the mic.
Oh, sorry. What happens is you end up in an impossible situation. How do you promote reality? How do you promote society if you can't have any sex? How can you promote if you can't eat? How can you? And so the Manichaeans had basically developed a culture where you didn't have to do anything at all. So, well, how do you do that? Well, you enlist slaves, and you make the slaves do your killing. You make your slaves do all the dirty work, all the things you don't want to touch. And this becomes a kind of when you really dig down to these, what are ultimately progressives, you'll find a nasty side to almost all of them. From the Nazi, most people will think the Nazis were a conservative sect that went wild. But if you really dig into it, you find out they started out as a liberal sect.
Well, it's actually right in their name, if you think about it. National Socialist German Workers' Party. I mean,
right.
What part of that says right wing? The whole thing is left wing, and I've even posted on my Facebook page, stop calling leftist hate groups like the Nazis right wing. It's complete nonsense.
Well, and then what gets completely disavowed is the whole idea of Marx and Stalin and all that kind of stuff. Clearly we're not advocating any kind of, I'm not trying to underplay the 6 million Jews that were killed, but 18 million Christians were killed in Soviet Russia.
Right.
And you find numbers of that even increasing.
Or about
communist China.
How about like this Chunk Yogurt guy who runs this news channel online, Young Turks, to glorify the Turkish genocide of Christian Armenians, and this stuff is always played down.
You had a little thing you read before the show.
Yeah, you want me to read it?
Yeah, what I'm going to do, I'm going to stall here while you're reading it. I'm trying to find some quotes here that while you read that, I'm going to look for them.
All right. So you just want me to buy you some time?
Buy some time, but I think it's relevant. It'll be relevant.
All right. So this is something I wrote yesterday. There's 2 parts to this, and I just kind of stuck them together because they actually really flow. It was one thought, and then it grew into another one. Leftist victimhood mentality is flabbergasting to contemplate. They're not responsible for anything they do. Steal a car? The car owner was a racist. Shoplift? The store owners were white racists for reporting the crime. Kill someone? It's justified because the victim was a, buzzword, racist. The left is never responsible for their own behavior, period. It's always blame casting onto someone else to avoid responsibility at any and all cost. There's no self-reflection in the mind of the leftist. Any and all problems in a leftist life are the responsibility of white people and Trump only. Do crack cocaine for 15 years, never worked, can't keep a job, in and out of jail and homeless because of it? It's the white man keeping you down. You're not responsible for the crack pipe in your hand. Someone else put it there and forced you to take a hit. The leftist has the mentality of a 3-year-old who hasn't learned to be responsible for their own behavior yet. It's arrested development. It's the final stages of the nanny state. The greatest issue of our time is how do we teach the feeble minds of leftists responsibility for their own actions? Parents who have basement dwellers beyond 21, time to kick them out today and teach them responsibility. Teach them work ethics, how to build things, and how to be self-sufficient or self-reliant. No more nanny state. No more man-child living in the basement. No more children suckling into their 40s. It's time to teach people how to grow up. Another issue with most leftists is that they soak up hyperbole from the leftist socialist university professors being told what to think rather than how to think. Think of the trivium that I've been teaching and putting out there for a decade now. The young, impressionable leftist leaves college with nearly no life experience, but believing that they're smarter and have more experience and wisdom than those with actual life experience and wisdom. The young leftist has never raised children and family, purchased a home, run a business, done hard work, raised their own food. Leaving college on mommy and daddy's dime, the leftist believes that they're the responsibility of someone else. Someone else paid for them through college. That college tuition should be free. And after all, when they left for college, mommy and daddy paid for everything and wiped their asses as babies. So why shouldn't their whole lives be a free ride? Incapable of thinking critically and being spoon-fed socialist propaganda throughout college, the leftists can't understand the ramifications of their false beliefs. Needing safe spaces rather than allowing free speech, needing big government to hold their hand through life like mommy and daddy did in their childhood, the leftist continues down this path of victimhood because, to them, with no life responsibilities, everything should be free for them and everyone else is responsible for their well-being but them. Not having any children themselves, or likely I should say, the leftist is a child well into adulthood. It's extended adolescence because being a parent teaches you responsibility for another life. If you're 40 and still don't have children, you're likely still caught in that child mentality.
Okay, now I'd like to build on that because what you're going to find even in the article that I wrote, and I tried to make it a key point in my Dead Sea Scroll thing, is that for some reason since the 1940s, we've got this pristine idea of what Marxism is. That Marxism somehow leads to this pristine utopian state where everybody's treated equal, that the division of labor is equitable to everybody, the division of all the goods, everybody gets what they want and nobody suffers. So in my research, I tried to find out who Karl Marx really was. And one of the books that I found fairly recently was a book written by a guy named Wurmbrand. And he was a Lutheran pastor underneath the Soviet regime. And the name of the book is called Marx and Satan. And I think he gives you an insight into Karl Marx that academia won't give you. And it gave me an insight that I had never really thought that much before. So here's a bit from this book. Marx even championed slavery in North America. For this, he quarreled with his friend Proudhon, who had advocated the emancipation of slaves in the US. Marx wrote in response, quote, "Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed in a patriarchal country. Wipe North America from the map of the world and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Abolish slavery and you will have wiped America off the map of nations." That's Karl Marx. And there's
the irony in these nitwit socialists and communists going around beating the socialist communist drum and not realizing that Marxist was pro-slavery.
Right. And Marx literally does use the N word quite several times in his writings.
And the BLM are openly Marxist.
Right. Right. So
Talk
where's
talk
the
about
irony?
talk about brain dead there.
But the thing is, the important thing I'd like to bring up here, though, is that as a theologian, the idea of equating Marxism with Satanism, I had never really thought about, and I never knew that there was evidence that would purport that.
When did you come to this conclusion?
Just in the last few weeks.
Because I've been at this same conclusion that Marxism was Satanism for maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I had thought of it, but I kind of hold judgment back until I can actually find something
right
in their writing. The thing is, I want to take you down a little trip here. When Adam Smith developed capitalism, we tend to think that this is a financial system, that capitalism has to do with making money and spending money, and all has to do with money. And that's not really what he intended. In a purely capitalist system, the idea is that you can equate anything that you do with value. Your ideas have value, your thoughts have value, your possessions have value, your reputation has value. All the things that you possess to some degree or another has value and is tradable in a sense on the open market. So now you think of what I think a Marxist considers a capitalist society is you think of a society where I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and it's kind of beneficial to us both. And if we have an equitable relationship, both of our lives are made better. As you know, I live in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's becoming a little bit of a fireplace, firebed lately with protests and things. I drove past one of these protests.
Oops.
It's unmistakable. You go to a lot of these people are society's misfits. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that yourself.
Oh yeah, of course. And almost entirely young people under the age of 24, 25.
Okay, so now they criticize capitalism. What are they really criticizing? And I think understanding Satanism gives you a window, whether they would call themselves Satanists or not. The essence of Satanism is taking everything and turn it upside down. So you and I look at being reputable, being honest, as being the rules of society, that if you follow the rules of society, it's going to add to your wealth somehow. Whether it's going to make you rich or not, maybe not. But the idea is that at least my life will be better by being honest, being friendly, being sincere, doing a day's work and all that kind of stuff is going to make my life better than what it had been had I not done these things. But you look at this world through the idea of a misfit. Maybe it's not tactful to say that, but somebody who doesn't quite fit in society is going to look at all those rules as being a conspiracy against their livelihood. So what is their pristine society? Their pristine society, if I look at all these rules of society as being something beneficial, they're going to see that as rules themselves as being a conspiracy against them.
Right.
And so,
when you get it, it's all of the rules and laws, Old, New Testament, all of it are the rules for building a highly functioning society, so that we can all get along in there. And
right. But if you're a misfit,
right, and the Satanist takes that and inverts it and sells the exact opposite, which coincides with communism and the left and the Fabian socialists and Aldous Huxley and all the hyperbole sold out of the Esalen Institute up in Northern California. They do the exact opposite, and we can see the total decay and collapse of society.
Exactly right. And so what they do is they one of the books I have that was very, very hard to find was called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And there's several books written by two guys named one guy Horkheimer, another one is Adorno. And they
Theodore Adorno.
Yeah, they were the founders of the critical theory movement. And a lot of these books, if you actually look back, you'll find that if you find the modern day versions of them, they've been censored.
You'd laugh to know that Theodor Adorno was a member of worked for the Tavistock Institute, Frankfurt School. He was also a part of the Princeton Radio Research Project and a founding member of the Fabian Society. But the Princeton Radio Research Project is who did the War of the Worlds broadcast to test, large national broadcasts as systems of mind control to create mass hysteria. Well, what do we just have this year? Mass hysteria. People walking around wearing face diapers and all that stuff. And, this all starts with Adorno and that group of people.
Right. And I don't know if you've ever seen the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, but it's unreadable. And what it is a manual for deconstructing society through criticism. And so what they're trying to do, every page of the book is taking something anti-logos. In fact, at some point, they even admit it, that what they're trying to do is deconstruct the whole idea of what reason is, going back to what I would say is the very essence of non-contradiction.
Well, that's logic. Logic is the art of non-contradiction. And where do we get the word logic from? Logos.
Right. But the essence, I don't know if you've taken a course in logic, but one of the first days in my course on logic, the professor specifically said, if you want to deconstruct logic, introduce a tautology. And what he used as an example was the idea of, envision this phrase written out, this sentence is false. So you take a sentence, is just that sentence becomes its own world unto itself. It doesn't appeal to any outside logic. The only appeal of truth it has is to itself, except it inverts that logic in the formulation of the sentence. So now, is the sentence true or is it false? If you think it's true, it's false. If you think it's false, it's true. That type of you can't really call it a paradox. It's a paradox. It's a tautological paradox of some sort. But what it does is it becomes a mental game where if you incorporate that kind of paradox as a truth, it literally collapses your entire reasoning system. The professor specifically said that if you want to collapse a society, get them to accept the tautology as truth. Well, there's Marxism.
Right. That makes perfect sense, really.
Yeah.
So let's go back for a minute. Let's talk about Jesus, because in the leftist mind, and I've had this same conversation within the last couple of months with a cousin of mine, Jesus was the biggest progressive ever. And,
So you want me to deconstruct that?
Well, hold on a second. Yeah. But I want to preface that, and it's hard to get someone to understand that giving to homeless people or to charities or through Christian goodwill, etc., is very different than the leftist, communist, socialist ideal of having an uber large government going around using violence to steal to redistribute that wealth, and so that everybody, whether or not they participate, gets an equal share. Now, I used to live in a communist country back in the 90s. I lived in Serbia and Yugoslavia back in the 90s.
I thought you were going to say California, but...
Well, no, that's now, so... So, yeah, there's that issue. But, back in the 90s, you could really see this stuff. And I lived there with my ex-wife and her family. They were Serb, and we would travel back and forth and live there every summer and then come back here and work and save up to go back there during the next summer. But, people were miserable there. Most of the stores didn't have much in them. You go to the grocery store, you might be able to get a loaf of bread one day a week. You might be able to get some sour cream one day a week. You might be able to get a little fish one day a week. And they were never on the same day, And this is, this is what people want. And you couldn't go and build your own home, generally speaking. Maybe out in the country you could, but in the cities, everything was basically condo apartment buildings where everyone had the exact same living, and they were all cookie cutter, cookie cutter, cookie cutter. And this is the so-called utopia that the left wants. Now, what also happened was, without competition, with everybody just, getting an equal level in things, there was no will to or want to do better, to do good work. So the quality of labor dropped and people did crappy work, or, if they worked at all. And they didn't care if they did a good job or a bad job because they got paid either way.
Right. All right. If you really want to read the Bible and get, this is the story you're not going to get in seminaries, but you can check it out. You can look it up. What happened was around 400 or 500 BC, the Jews were captured by the Babylonians, and they were moved to Babylonia under what was called the Babylonian exile. So eventually you have a bunch of episodes that happen, but what eventually happens is a guy named Esdras is released, and he takes a contingencies of Jews back to Israel to recreate traditional Judaism. Some people get this wrong, but what happens is that a large contingency of Jews are left in Babylonia, which would be Iran today, kind of largely Iran. So these Jews go back, they reconstruct the temple and return it. They reconstruct the scriptures, they reconstruct the traditions of the Jews and everything. What happens right before the turn of the millennium is a guy named Herod gets, as a proxy king, gets put in charge of the Jews and be proclaimed king of the Jews. He had none of the heredity. He really wasn't even an authentic Jew. And every Jew in Judaism knew that he wasn't an authentic Jew, that he had been placed there. In order to be authentic, he married into it. So that he didn't have any claimants to the throne, he killed his sons. But as a power play, he gets a fellow Babylonian to come down and their design was to take over the temple. So what comes down, and you can look this up too, is in some sense, I'm trying to be careful what to say here. The guy he gets to be in charge of the temple is a person named Hillel the Elder. And if you look up Hillel the Elder, coincidentally, a lot of even though people are doubtful as to how much these stories are true, it's in one of my books, but a lot of his stories are oddly similar to Christ. That somebody is literally paraphrasing the things like the golden rule, the idea that he was a carpenter, but all these stories post-date Christ. So what happens is, what you're going to find is that if you're really going to look who are the progressives of that time period, what you're going to find is what's initially called in the Bible the Herodians, who eventually become the Pharisees. And it's the Pharisees who develop their own system of dialectical system. They're the ones who are the idealists, who actually have this idea that they're going to dress like the Roman citizens, they're going to have parties with the Romans, they're doing all this. And what you see by actually investigating who the Pharisees were, that they were the progressives, they were the non-traditionalists. And then what we have a want to do in society now, after following Luther and the Protestants and things, we have a tendency to see Christ as being a reformer, that Judaism was wrong. They needed somebody to come along and rebuild Judaism and remold it for the next, forever. But what you're going to find is that story isn't exactly true. What Christ literally was doing, if you check it out, he was the traditionalist. And all of his things, even the idea of communion and things, were going back to much earlier and older Jewish customs. That he was renovating them a bit, but he was trying to recover older and older things. And if you read, it doesn't take much to understand this, that if you go to church and you hear a lot of the readings, once you get on the other side of this, you'll hear these readings as something completely different. That what Christ is, he's criticizing the Pharisees for constantly defying Moses' law, for taking Moses and taking the authority of Moses and trashing it. And so what happens is Christ, and this is where I end up with a lot of this stuff, is if you actually understand the crucifixion and you understand how the interplay actually works through from both sides, you'll understand that these are constantly fights between faith and reason and which supersedes which. What happens at the time after the crucifixion, you end up with the destruction of Jerusalem. The Pharisees basically win at that point, and the Christians have to flee. That, in a sense, becomes the what that is based on. What the Pharisees are based on is not scripture. They were based on this Talmud that was their records as Babylonian Jews. In fact, it's even called the Babylonian Talmud, and it's the basis of it's the basis of the Kabbalah. It's the basis of mysticism and all this other stuff. Over time, the Jews and Judaism and Christianity, one has they treat Christ as different entities, but modern day Jews, for the most part, aren't that different from modern day Christians in a lot of sense. Yeah, I could point out differences, but the idea of who the Pharisees were in the first century as really progressives gets missed entirely by society and by academia.
Progressives in the modern sense, which is a buzzword or a remarketing of the word communism.
I think I would put them right in that camp, because they were basically taking traditional Judaism and they were taking it. This is the suspicious point, is they were moving it from a sacramental thing to a verbal thing, which dispensed with a sacramental religion, which by the time they were already inventing that, by the time the temple was destroyed. And so you have to wonder, once the temple wasn't needed anymore, who was it, the Romans or was it the Jews that destroyed it? There's evidence both ways. So at that point, it's a fait accompli that you can't practice traditional Judaism. You look at all the things they lost once the temple was destroyed. They lost the scriptures, the original scriptures. They lost the most important is all the records and documents as to who was the priestly line, who was, all that kind of stuff. You lost the building, you lost the ability to do sacrifices. So now you've got to invent different customs and things to replace those. That by definition is progressive.
Yep, that's a good point. Well, or they could have just ended it and.
Well, what happened though is that's where you get the formulation of the Christian church. The Christian church is the continuation of traditional Judaism. And that what they do is then you take the old.
And that's just what I was about to say as well.
Right. And so what you do is you take the old customs and you modify them to the best you can. Every church becomes a temple instead of having one temple. Every clergy person represents the Levitical line. You do your best to continue it in the best ways you can, and then you incorporate the rest of the world as being open to that religion. So at that, we tend to take that thing and see that as progressive, but that was done out of necessity. It wasn't like the early Christians or the Jews at that time were purposely trying to do it. It was a response to go back to first century, and I dare anybody to look back and say, this is what everybody, you say Jesus wouldn't have worn a mask. You say Jesus wouldn't have a lot of these different things you hear it all the time. But you look at the first century, the pandemic at the time was leprosy. And what did they do with the lepers? They quarantined them, but they didn't quarantine society. There's no evidence of Christ wearing masks and running around, and they weren't stupid people. They still treated the lepers with compassion. In fact, Christ made sure that like the Samaritans, a lot of they were frowned on by a lot of the populace, but He ensured that they were treated like people. But to say that Christ would have been a progressive and would have wore a mask and would have locked down society and would have done all these other things that they're doing, there's no evidence of that. And I would dare say you had, just like Kenosha, just like Portland, Oregon, you had Rome burning, you had Jerusalem burning, you had a very similar situation going on.
So, what, in your opinion, to summarize, have the millennials missed? Or what don't they understand?
I think what they don't understand is they see Marxism from their schooling as being this utopian thing. And they don't realize that it's inversion of everything we take as hold sacred. It's an inversion.
And I think a few years ago I did a show just on inversion, but that's even a concept that's hard for people to get their mind around. You and I take it for granted.
Yeah.
But, it's literally taking, so, what the Satanists really do is they go through the Bible, and wherever it says not to do something, they invert it and they do it. Right. That goes for Aleister Crowley, for Aldous Huxley, for and the Fabian Socialists that Huxley was a part of. All of these people, they want to break society as a whole. They have some strange hatred for the laws and rules that maintain our high-functioning society, and they want to break that. So they go through and they promote everything it says not to do. Well, you shouldn't have, you shouldn't have open homosexuality. Well, let's promote that. We're going to put it in every TV show for the last 7 or 8 years. We're going to put it on magazine covers. We're going to promote it heavily, 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 heavily. And the Jaffa Memo for 1969 clearly shows that for eugenics, they're going to promote that. So let me just pull this Jaffa Memo up. And people can see that there, and in this, here, I'll just pull it over from this one. People can see on this left column, it says encourage increased homosexuality. This is memorandum to Bernard Berelson, President, Population Council, found in archives relevant to the study of population policy for the U.S., March 11, 1969, by Frederick S. Jaffe, Vice President of Planned Parenthood. So, once we start realizing that all of these behaviors that they are promoting as freedom and whatnot are eugenics, are, in World War I and World War II, people would travel Europe that were a part of this socialist agenda and communist agenda, and they would see the carnage caused by people like Hitler and Tolstoy and Stalin and who is the other one now? Lenin and Mao ad infinitum, pretty much. But they would see the carnage and the massive death toll that these people caused, and then they came up with the idea of self-eugenics.
Right.
How do you get someone to take out their own family tree? You're going to promote homosexuality. You're going to promote free love and partying. You're going to promote extended adolescence or arrested development, so that rather than settling down and having a family in your 20s,
you're all under the guise of population control.
Right. You're gonna extend that out to the 40s. You're gonna tell women, well, you shouldn't be in the home having families. That's the man suppressing you, feminism and Gloria Steinem. What you need to do is chase a career, so that by the time you figure out that you want a family, you're probably too old to have one. Someone corrected me. Trotsky, not Tolstoy. Thank you for that. And so, all of this stuff plays out, but all of these things are the left's agendas that they promote. They are eugenics and degeneracy to break society and to literally bring about the new, let's call it what it is, the fall.
Right. And what you asked me at the beginning, could I bring it back around to the paper? what I tried to show in the Tiny Tim paper was that I personally regard the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as near sacred documents.
Correct. Right.
And what makes them sacred, near sacred, is, I think, basically centered on one line, that we consider inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That those aren't rights that I can't grant, nor can I take them away. They're given to you by the fact that you're a human, that you have a soul, and they're granted by God, if you want to put it that way, which way I would put it. But what happens when Woodrow Wilson becomes president, who's considered the quintessential, even though they now disavow him because they consider him a racist, but he literally was the first progressive president. And he literally says in his writings that we're now going to invert those principles, that no longer are these rights that are granted, these are rights that are expanded and given to you by the state. And so you talk about inversion of rules and inversion of principles. If life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever inalienable rights are, inalienable or unalienable, whichever one you want to use, they're rights that I can't confer or take away. They're not something I have any authority over.
Correct.
What progressives are doing is claiming authority over those things.
Well, and what do? They want to get rid of the right to private property, because what comes right behind that? Then you can't even state that this is my body. And that's right. Exactly what they want to do. The left wants to promote vaccines, and the Nazis, the communists took massive amounts of life because you disagreed with the state's narrative. So that's part of the agenda behind it.
So to bring this to a close, what I would say what millennials don't get is this inversion principle of rules, that the essence of whether you believe in Satanism, you're functionally a Satanist if you take truths that are inalienable and invert them and make them upside down and read them backwards. They're upside down.
You're a Mark Passio.
Right.
Well said. So anyway, thanks everyone for participating. Hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the bell so you get notifications. Next week, I believe Constance Comby is back, so we should have something good to talk about there. She's going to be talking about QAnon, or Canon, or however you want to pronounce that, the Q group, and everything about that. We're going to have a good time. She's a cool old lady to have on. Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have to have you back again sometime soon. Let me know when you have more research you'd like to discuss.
Will do.
And thanks, everybody. Please hit the super chat or go to logosmedia.com and donate or support the show. Get a membership over there, etc. Can't do it without you. Down in the links, there's links to Patreon, etc. for supporting the show. Greatly appreciate your support. Take care, everyone, and good night.